Let me introduce and welcome our first speaker, Dr. Tabea Lissner, who is the co-head of the science team at Climate Analytics Organization, which is a non-profit organization. Her team focuses on climate change adaptation, vulnerability and risk, as well as how adaptation effectiveness might change with increasing global warming. Dr. Lissner is also the lead author for the chapter on water and the drafting author for the summary for policymakers' special report of the recently published IPCC Sixth Assessment Report of Working Group 2. Before I hand over to Dr. Lissner, I would like to remind you to scan the Slido QR code on the top right corner, key in the code, and you can start posting your questions. Please indicate the speaker's name if you would like to address it to specific speakers. Let us now welcome Dr. Lissner to share with us the projected changes in inland water-related risks and the different adaptation solutions based on findings in the IPCC report. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and let me briefly set up so I can share my screen. Great. So from my side, it looks like you are seeing the starting slide of my presentation.
Yes.
So it's a great pleasure to be able to speak in this webinar today and share some of the key results out of one of the reports that have been published by the IPCC over the last few years. As was mentioned, you may have seen that last week, the final report out of this assessment cycle was published, the synthesis report that really brings together all of the results of the 6 IPCC reports that were published over the last few years. I will be focusing on the assessment report of the Working Group 2 that assesses impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and specifically highlights some of the results around water-related changes and also around adaptation solutions. This will be, as is the nature of the IPCC report, a rather global synthesis to set the scene, and then I'm really looking forward also to get much more specific insights from the other speakers later on. So to jump right into the assessment, if my computer allows me to. There we go. So what is very clear from the report and very important to note, and I guess that is also widely known by now, is that climate change is not a question of the distant future, but really global warming has already caused dangerous and widespread impacts across the globe, across all regions of the world, and also across all ecosystems and all human systems. And this is really something that by now we can also show scientifically and is really documented across the report. So this figure, without wanting to go into too much detail, really highlights that across all different world regions, and in this figure we see the different ecosystems with a focus also on freshwater ecosystems. We really do see with high or very high confidence that changes have been detected that can be attributed to the around 1.1 degrees of warming that we see presently. What is also very clear in the kind of global synthesis of that report is that every increment of further warming leads to higher risk. What is, I think, really striking about this report is that where prior other reports really assessed risks to become very high and very, very severe at higher levels of warming, with the increased granularity and increased knowledge that we were able to synthesize in this report, we really see that already now we're facing very high risks in some of the unique and threatened systems already at the present level of warming. And 1.5 degrees really presents a very important kind of guardrail, if you will, above which every increment of warming will really lead to much higher impacts, some of which might be irreversible. So it really drives home the very importance of limiting warming to also reduce risk, but at the same time really also shows that we are facing risk today. So adaptation will need to go hand in hand with mitigation to really be able to address these challenges. To now zoom into the water sector, what we assessed in our chapter is really, we looked into different sectors and in how far water-related changes are already visible across the globe. And what we find is that across all water-related sector, first and foremost, of course, agriculture, very important, but also many other sectors, the urban or ecosystems, but also different hydrometeorological hazards. We really see that in all world regions, we see with different levels of confidence, but quite distinctly, that changes are documented, and we really see severe negative impacts across the globe in the water sector or driven by changes in water. These impacts, of course, manifest themselves as risks to very important aspects of human livelihoods. And this example here shows in how far drought and other climate-related hazards have impacted food security and have led to food production loss events. And when we look globally over the last few decades, we see on the one hand that climate-driven impacts to food productions have really increased massively across the globe, but especially also a drought signal is becoming visible in this context. What we see is that, of course, these aspects around food security disproportionately affect vulnerable communities, especially in developing countries, who really do have to use a large share of their income to ensure food security and are often dependent directly on agriculture. But also, the increasing frequency and severity of climate extremes causes really much more widespread impacts to ecosystems, people, communities, and infrastructure beyond this example as well. Of course, climate change is not uniform across the globe, but clearly we see that some parts of the world are getting wetter while some parts are getting drier. Very often this is also the case that it kind of reinforces current patterns of aridity and higher precipitation or wet regions in the world. And this really shows the distribution of observed trends in annual precipitation over the last century, where we already do see quite patterns of changes that are emerging globally. As we well know, of course, also though, is that there is a large variability in precipitation. So what we looked into also is how unusual the changing precipitation patterns that we are experiencing now are for present populations. And what we see quite clearly that while in many regions of the world there's not such a clear signal, we do see emerging patterns of unfamiliar, unusual, or even, well, unknown, where we say 1 in 100-year events could be considered unknown for present populations, are emerging for quite large regions of the world, which of course then poses questions for adaptation already at present. When looking into adaptation, of course, it's also very important to see in how far different population groups or how much of the population is actually affected by these changes. So this figure shows how many people are experiencing changes in precipitation globally. And what we see that many millions of people are starting to live in conditions that are drier than previously, so are experiencing an emerging trend of unusual conditions, whereas many more people are actually currently experiencing wetter conditions, also going along with extreme precipitation and having implications for flooding, for example. But the average precipitation, of course, is only one important indicator of changes in water availability, and it could still be a situation where the overall precipitation over the year increases, but there's still an increase in dry spells as well. So looking into dry spells, we actually see that while average precipitation might not be dropping in some regions, many more millions of people are actually seeing drier conditions as well, in terms of extended dry spells, where there's still a significant number of people that see a reduction in these consecutive dry days that would indicate drought conditions. When we look into projections of changes, that I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to provide a glimpse, and also the importance that this has for adaptation, is that what we see that with increasing warming, we also have increasing uncertainty in the models that we have to look into changes in precipitation and water availability. And that, of course, provides huge challenges for adaptation, because all of the scenarios then increasingly show a larger spread of what is actually possible in terms of extremes, both in terms of increasing drier conditions or increasing wet conditions. So what we looked into in terms of policy challenges to address water scarcity by mid-century is really to assess in how far the modeling spreads, so the uncertainty with increasing warming increases, and in how far that is combined with the potential for high water scarcity as a combination of population growth and water availability. And what we see is that there's a number of regions, especially also across Asia, that will be facing high uncertainty out of the models, but also have the potential for high water scarcity. So that really poses, of course, huge challenges for adaptation and water management to really be able to find solutions that combine that. I would like to focus in a little bit on the topic of flooding, because of course it's a very essential component of hydrometeorological hazards from climate change, and of course also poses huge adaptation challenges. And it has been one of the major causes for disasters globally. So the WMO estimates that 44% of all disasters over the last 50 years were related to flooding. A little bit less of the overall economic losses were related to flooding, but that doesn't mean, of course, that the effects of flooding weren't severe. Also in terms of other effects that are non-economic. What we see very clearly in terms of what can be detected over the last decades is that the frequency and magnitude of river floods have changed, but there is very high regional variation in terms of the direction of this. What we see quite clearly, though, in terms of the driver, the climate change driver in terms of human-induced climate change has increased the likelihood of a number of major heavy precipitation events that then, of course, may lead to flooding, especially over Asia, but also in Europe and over the Americas, and that has resulted in disastrous impacts. But we do again see a lot of variability also in the effects of what that extreme precipitation actually have, because of course, as we all know, the precipitation and then the hydrometeorological aspects are only one important aspect to then determine flooding, and also the impacts of flooding, of course, but socioeconomic development and flood management, water management are absolutely essential in actually determining the effects and the impacts that we have. As a consequence, what is very important in the assessment of the IPCC is to really bring together this view of the hazard, so the changes in climate actually that might drive an increase in risk, but really look also into the vulnerability. So in the case of flooding, the protection level, and also the exposure and how far there's actually population that might be affected by flooding, because of course it's not always a negative outcome, I guess. And of course, an adaptation plays a huge role in determining over time how that might be changing. So what we see quite clearly in terms of the hazard itself is that the frequency and magnitude of river floods are projected to change at global scale, with a potential for an increase there as well. But there is also a very large component in terms of exposure in inundation areas that then would drive large parts of an increase of direct flood damages that we see under all of the scenarios that we assessed. So the socioeconomic drivers are super important, and that again kind of also alludes to the very importance of adaptation in that context. Looking again at this combination of changes in the potential for river flooding, but also the population that might be exposed, we see here different scenarios of warming combined with different population projections, and then also again in the bottom right, how that might play out at different warming levels. We do see that it makes a huge difference for flood risk, what level of warming we actually look at, where there will be an increase in risks for river flooding already at 2 degrees that is significant, of around 120% increase of potential population affected by flooding, but this is massively increased at 4 degrees of warming. So that really drives home again the point that it's an essential component, but still population and exposure, of course, play a very important role. But yeah, the highest numbers of people affected, regardless of the scenario that we look at, are situated in Asia. So it's a very important aspect. What is very clear is that investments in adaptation will be essential and will, of course, also be costly. But at the same time, if we look at comparisons between the cost of adaptation and non-adaptation, we see that the potential rewards in these global models of adaptation absolutely outweigh the costs. So one assessment estimates the needed investments in hard infrastructure to deal with river floods to cost between 4 and 9 billion per year, but it can massively reduce damages by 22 to up to 70 billion per year. So there's definitely a lot of importance on this, and similar results I guess are achieved depending on the setup of the modeling study. I'd like to focus a little bit more on what we see overall in terms of water and adaptation that has been documented already across the globe. So water is absolutely central to adaptation. Might not surprise many of you here in the audience, but looking into a meta review of adaptation options that have been assessed in detail and that also really assess the different benefits and the effectiveness of adaptation, we see that more than 60% of all the documented adaptation is occurring in response to water-related hazards. I think it might be a little bit hard to see, but the core responses focused on responses to drought or precipitation variability, a little bit less to floods. And then there's also a broad focus on more general climate impacts that are in relation to water. A lot of the adaptation that is documented relates to agriculture and water combinations, because of course agriculture is the largest water user globally. But of course, we do see adaptation happening across a number of different options and sectors. It was quite interesting to find that there's currently limited evidence of risk reduction of adaptation that is documented. So simply there is, in the scientific literature at least, not enough focus on monitoring and evaluation of adaptation to really be able to assess whether risk reduction is actually taking place. But what is very clear is that there is a number of benefits that are associated with adaptation. So there's a lot of positive outcomes in terms of economic benefits, livelihood benefits. In the Global South, these are really the main beneficial outcomes around economic and livelihood related positive benefits. Where in the Global North, we also see a lot of positive outcomes around environmental questions that go beyond the actual direct focus of risk reduction. What we're, of course, also very interested in is to better understand what we know about future adaptation and the potential for adaptation to address projected risk. what we see to date is that certainly there are at present gaps between the adaptation that is being implemented to date and what would actually be needed to address present risks. So as we see, there's still massive losses incurred by different hydrometeorological hazards. So with increasing warming already today, adaptation is needed at higher speed and higher scales that we see today, and depending on how much further warming we see over the next few decades, that pressure, of course, increases. Of course, there's many adaptation options that provide benefits, like behavioral options, and there's only some aspects that can be assessed for future effectiveness. So we can only really assess the future effectiveness of adaptation of options that we're able to implement into the projections and into the models. But for the water chapter, we actually did a systematic assessment of the projected effectiveness of adaptation with increasing warming for those aspects that can actually be introduced into models. And the results of that assessment are actually quite sobering. So in this figure, you see again on the left side, so those blue dots, the assessment of the different beneficial outcomes of adaptation at present. So kind of following up from the previous figure. And for those same options, we also did an assessment in how far they're effective at reducing risk at different levels of warming. And what we see is that water-related adaptation is most effective up to 1.5 degrees of warming, and then with every degree of warming, we see a decline in the effectiveness to reduce the share of risk. So the residual impacts that remain after adaptation increase with increasing warming, of course, under the assumption that the options are introduced as is. So there is a lot of need for, well, investing in new innovative approaches to adaptation in that context to be able to deal with higher levels of risk. But again, it kind of underlines this point of needing to really limit warming to as low as possible for adaptation to successfully be able to deal with the increasing pressures around climate change. Without wanting to go into too much detail, but this is again a visualization of the different options that we were able to assess. In blue, the darker the blue, the more effective a specific option is in its potential to reduce risk. Where on the right side, in the reddish color, the darker the shade of red, the more residual impacts are incurred. And I think it really drives home again the point that we do see quite a decline from 1.5 to 4 degrees, which of course is very concerning. What is also very important to note in this context is that there are limits to adaptation. So there's not only the effectiveness aspect, so the share of risk that can actually be reduced, but then there's, I guess, outside factors such as governance, institutional aspects, but also access to finance and access to information that really limit the ability of a given system. And I'm sure many of you are well aware of this, that limit the ability to plan and also implement adaptation. But there's also biophysical aspects that are super important to take into account that will make it very difficult for some regions to adapt. So especially for small islands, for example, that are in themselves very remote and very much dependent on a groundwater lens for freshwater access. We see that above 1.5 degrees of warming already for some regions, we may face biophysical, so hard limits to adaptation in terms of access to fresh water for those regions. At higher levels of warming, we then see more regions being faced with potential hard limits. So southern parts of Europe, for example, will see or are likely to see limits to the irrigation potential due to freshwater limitations. And of course, also mountainous regions in the world that are dependent on snow melt and glacier melt for freshwater availability and will be increasingly challenged in terms of access to the water resources as it's currently set up. So these are really, really very important aspects to keep in mind for many regions of the world. As I mentioned, there's also a number of constraints that make adaptation challenging. So we looked into what is documented currently and what makes adaptation most difficult for different adaptation options. And it's quite clear that, of course, access to finance is a very, very important aspect, because, of course, the priorities still need to be set for adaptation to really be at the forefront of investment also. But a lot of institutional and governance factors and policies also make it difficult to really implement integrated approaches to adaptation. And then there's a number of additional factors that also play a role, but it's really those two that we saw globally and across different options really pose the most important constraints to adaptation. And finally, what the report also highlights is that, of course, adaptation cannot be designed to prevent every increment of damage and loss. And with more extremes being expected, adaptation will be increasingly challenged to really prevent all losses and damages. So on the one hand, it's really important for effective adaptation to be enabled, that we need climate resilient development that really integrates a lot of the different factors that need to be addressed for the climate challenge. So it's really integrated solutions that invest in mitigation and in adaptation and really build more resilient systems overall, which then also, again, as I mentioned before, requires also urgent and ambitious climate action quite immediately for this to be possible. But of course, it's very important also to look into integrated solution and also potentially more transformative action to really be able to look into those long-term perspectives to be able to integrate this. So this already brings me to the last slide of the report, of my presentation. So it's absolutely unequivocal, I guess, what is really put together across this report, that climate change is obviously a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. But we do have a rapidly closing, but there is a window to secure a livable future through concerted action that really invests into this climate resilient development and really brings a lot of opportunities also, I guess, through adaptation and really building resilience. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm very, very glad that I was able to give this broad overview. And I'm, of course, also very excited to hear further details after this very broad global scale, setting the scene on further information on adaptation.